When I'm helping my clients to improve their performance, one of the things that I always make sure that they understand is the value of progressions when you're trying to improve. It's been proven time and time again that if you want to get from point A to point B, you need to take a series of small steps and you need to achieve success at each of those small steps. If you just try to make a giant leap from where you are to where you want to be, the chances of success drop dramatically. So learning how to understand the steps to take from one place to the next place, very, very important. Now, I use a lot of different progressions in my coaching programs, and some of them are learning progressions, and some of them are more performance-oriented progressions. The one we're going to talk about today is the big performance progression, which is fear, focus, and flow. So if you're in a rut, or you're performing very poorly, or struggling, you feel like your skills are way higher than your performance, that means your performance is being influenced by fear. Now, fear can come in a number of forms. It can be a simple physical fear, like fear of injury. More often than not, it's a psychological fear, a performance anxiety, or fear of success, or fear of failure is the most common one for sure. Now, when we're talking about fear, what we're talking about is something that takes you out of the present. And we talked in a number of videos how important it is for you to be present in your senses and not be thinking. Well, fear is actually a thought with an emotional tag applied to it, and it's always a thought about something you're worried about happening in the future or something that's happened to the past that you don't want to happen again. So fear is one of the poorest things that you can use as an influence for performance. Now, oftentimes I hear people say, well, can't fear cause the adrenaline to come up? Absolutely it can, but if you don't know how to control it and you don't know how to move from the fear to a more positive state and a more present state, fear can be very debilitating and can put a ceiling on your ability to perform very well. So the next state in the fear focus flow is focus. And when we want to move from one area of performance, let's say fear in this case, to the next more positive area, which would be focus, it's also very important that we remember we have to replace the fear with something that is stronger than what we're replacing. It's very difficult. It certainly can be done, but it's very difficult just to identify a fear and then do a lot of psychological work and just drop the fear. It's difficult to let go of things completely, much easier to replace it with something else that's more strong and has a much better value for you in your performance. So in this case, what we would do is if somebody had a fear they were dealing with, we would identify the fear and we would explore where does it come from, and then we would, through training drills, usually performance-oriented training drills where you're simulating performance, we would identify some focus cues, visual cues or kinesthetic cues, which would help to give you the trust that you could perform in the way you want and start to let the fear fall into the background. So fears never really go away. Even the very, very top level athletes still deal with fears. But the top level athletes also have cues that allow them to move up from fear to focus so that they can get out of those performance ruts. This is a huge, huge piece of the puzzle in performance, is learning to replace what you don't want with something you do want and doing it quickly and efficiently. So, as I mentioned, focus cues should be oriented more towards visual or kinesthetic cues, and the reason for that is when you're in your senses, visual or kinesthetic, then you are much more present. You're not going to be thinking as much. All the things that we discussed in the learning versus sensing video come to play here. Then once you feel like you've got some trust that your focus cues will allow you to put the fear into the background, then you can start thinking about, well, how can I add in some flow cues? And flow is also another word for the zone. It's the peak of performance. It's where there's an absence of thought and there's an absence of tension and there's very, very singular, very, very strong goals. And there are a number of other indicators for the flow state or the zone state. But the ones we want to focus on in this particular case to move from the focus area to the flow area are what allows us to quiet more thoughts, relax the tension more, and have a very singular, very strong, and non-distracted goal. And that starts to bring us further and further up the fear, focus, flow progression. Now, this progression is not a black and white. It's not just cut off at one particular area for fear and cut off at another particular area for focus. There's a lot of gray areas in it, but as you're performing and as you're trying to work on your performance in training and monitor your performances when you're doing your competitions, it's very important that you make a little mental note afterwards. And I definitely would recommend even a 3x5 notebook to write down a few things after each performance. Was this performance most influenced by fear? Was it most influenced by focus? Or was it most influenced by flow? And once you do this a few times, you're going to start to get a very strong feel of what are the things that you associate feel-wise, visual-wise, emotionally, and physically with each of those different states. And the more you can identify the different ones, the easier it's going to be to lock into the ones that you want. And of course, the way that this relates to the brain waves that we've talked so much about is that the more you're in the fear state, the higher your brainwave frequency is. The more you're in the flow state, the lower your brainwave frequency is. So everything has this big relationship. But any time that you're practicing, but especially when you're performing, if you keep in mind what was the main influencer on that performance, was it fear? Was it focus or was it flow? And you start paying attention to that and really getting to know all the subtleties of those different states and how it feels in your movement and how it feels in your emotions and how it feels in your mental focus, you will really start to move forward very quickly.